The sutric paths don't adequately deal with sex and violence, I would argue. And sex and violence, or desire and arbitrary murder, were Girard's main concern. So according to Girard, the new atheists and the rationalists are dead wrong in saying that religion is an ignorant or archaic phenomenon. Religion is how we have contained the violence and desire since the beginning of time and thus created civilization. So we need religion to counter the scapegoat mechanism, perhaps even more today than ever, because in our interconnected world, all the tribal boundaries have fallen away, and we are faced with this terrible possibility of a war of all against all, which Owen talked about in great detail last time. So one of Girard's essential insights is that the closer we are to each other, the more potential we have for rivalrous conflict. And in the global village, in the internet age, we are in dangerous proximity, and there's always this potential for violent escalation. So in Christianity, you meditate on the ultimate scapegoat. You imitate Christ, which doesn't mean that you copy Jesus, right? But that you act with love instead of envy and resentment. And you offer yourself up as the scapegoat to protect the innocent victims and reveal the lie of the scapegoat mechanism. So love and imitation of Christ is this profound sacrifice. However, this is not exclusive to Christianity. And as Thomas told us in his previous presentation, Girard began to see the same patterns in all the great religions, in Hinduism and other religions. And this is where I want to pick up and to find out, how the other traditions deal with the scapegoat mechanism. And I want to focus on the religion that I'm most familiar with, and that is Buddhism. And I want to look at Sutric and Tantric Buddhism, and I want to ask the question, how do Buddhists deal with Memetic rivalry and this irresistible urge towards violent escalation and the institution of scapegoats, etc.? The first obvious answer is Donald Trump, is meditation. Okay? In meditation, you work with what's called the three poisons, which are passion, aggression, and ignorance, which you might as well call the scapegoat mechanism, because the scapegoat mechanism is based on the dynamics of passion, aggression, and ignorance. Here's an image of passion, aggression, and ignorance. So in meditation, you become aware of your own passion, aggression, and ignorance. This you could also think about in psychoanalytic terms. The three poisons correspond to maybe the Freudian pleasure principle, right? The need for immediate gratification. It's who we are before we actually become conscious of anything or aware of anything. So when we sit in meditation, we sit with our sexual fantasies, our dramas, our rivalries, our revenge fantasies, our hunger for power and submission, our greed, basically the entire Netflix movie that goes on in our mind, right? The pathos of our mind. We sit with that. And we dissolve the grasping and impulsive mind through attention, which is a kind of sacrifice, right? Attention is sacrifice. Being attentive to what is the proper mode of sacrifice in Buddhism. Mindfulness is the sacrifice of mimetic behavior and desires. And I would say this is the same in all religions. This is not unique to Buddhism. So it's placing our attention beyond passion, aggression, and ignorance, and the pleasure principle, if we want to bring Freud into it. So Buddhism tells us that the whole world and all of our psychosomatic experience is a kind of dense, habitual field, and it's actually a dimmed down reality. It's not the truth, it's an illusion, it's the matrix. So Buddha sort of tells us we're living in this matrix movie. And the goal of Sutric Buddhism is to be free of the matrix, right? It's to be free of habitual mechanical patterns and mimetic behaviors. So the liberated person becomes free of the wheel of samsara. Here's something I lifted from Thomas's Facebook page. This is Thomas Helmerich's image, in which he talks about Nietzschean will to power and resentment. So so the entire sort of wheel of samsara is this continuing memetic process where we move up, we move up the hierarchy into the realm of the gods, which is there in the center. And then we fall down again into the realm of the Titan jealous gods, which is a little bit lower, and then the human realm, and then we have the hell realm and the hungry ghost realm. And what am I missing? The animal realm. So this is this terrible human condition that we're in. We're stuck in this incredible memetic illusion, and we're trying to get up. We're trying to climb the ladder, but the top of the hierarchy is, in many ways, it's a place where you're a god and everything is blissful and wonderful, but then you're eventually going to fall back down again. So you see the Buddha here is outside of the wheel. He's escaped from this terrible wheel. He's escaped from the ego, and the mob, basically. So that's the goal of you could say Sutric Buddhism, to escape from this wheel. I used to practice Zen, and I remember I took part in a 3-month Korean Zen retreat where you would meditate for 18 hours a day in total silence. And in that kind of context, you have imitation. You have a sense of freedom that arises from everything. You experience this samadhi, which is complete meditative absorption, which feels something like peace, bliss, timelessness, freedom from any kind of conflict with reality. And this freedom could be so profound that you might want to just die in that state, because it's so you're released from all of this struggle of this terrible wheel of samsara. So, but this state of, let's say, bliss, emptiness, nothingness, nirvana, satori, there's many words for that state of total freedom, is actually a limitation, even in Sutrayana, because you have to come out of that, and you have to become a bodhisattva, which means you have to help liberate other beings who are trapped in these memetic cycles, in resentment and will to power, and all these different realms. And the interesting thing about the 6 realms is that the human realm is the only realm where you are able to become conscious of the whole process. So if you're a god, you can't escape the wheel of suffering, because you're living in a state of total happiness and bliss, and you're drinking nectar, and everything is so pleasurable that there's no chance for you to ever understand that you're actually in a matrix, or you're trapped on some level. So the human realm is the place where you can escape from this whole process. So, and also in Buddhism, there's something called taking refuge, and which is interesting, because taking refuge would seem like normally we're taking refuge in our passion, aggression, and ignorance. Like that's the normal state of affairs, is to take refuge in our power games and in our jealousies, and that's our, or in our, whatever we're very much attached to. That's the ordinary state. But when you take refuge in Buddhism, you take refuge in the Buddha Dharma Sangha, which is the teacher or the community and the teachings, and the Chogyam Trungpa, a master who I like very much, says that you make a vow to become homeless. In other words, it's a bit like saying you don't bow down to false idols. And these idols could be nationalism or family or identity politics or any kind of identity you might have in the 6 realms, but also your own inner idols, your projections, your models of desire. So you abandon this almost irresistible Dionysian mob that is always searching for a scapegoat. You get out of the rat race, so to speak. You stop taking refuge in your own passion, aggression, and ignorance, and you start to cultivate a higher view. So both Sutric Buddhism and Christianity have ethical and practical ways of dealing with the mechanics of memetic desire. We could also talk about the philosophy of emptiness. It is noticing that this whole process is fundamentally empty and leads nowhere. I once studied with a Zen teacher who said that Buddhism is the religion of wisdom and Christianity is the religion of love. So I thought that made sense. It's not an absolute dichotomy, but it's a good generalization. Generally speaking, Sutric Buddhism deals with the scapegoat mechanism through mind training. Of course, Christianity has mind training as well, and Buddhism has compassion and love as well. So these are not absolutes. Buddhism and Christianity go beyond this sort of primitive notion of sacrificing, where we sacrifice a goat or a virgin or, your annoying neighbor, your ex-wife, the local mad person, any perceived enemy. So you don't sacrifice any of that. You sacrifice yourself, your attention. You place your attention elsewhere. So I want to think of sacrifice as attention. And in terms of meditation, you transform the energy into samadhi, or a concentrated state. You subvert this powerful force into contemplation. So that's sutra. And there's a problem with sutra. And perhaps there's a problem with exoteric religion in general, and maybe church-going Christianity. If it doesn't go deeper, if it doesn't embody the more mystical aspects of its tradition. But so now I want to talk about what the problem is with sutra. What is the problem with sutra? What is the problem with all of that? And first of all, we want to say that it's essential. It's a base. So sutra is a base for tantra. You have to have an understanding of suffering, the Four Noble Truths, emptiness, impermanence, all of these Buddhist ideas. You have to have a basis for that before you can enter into Tantra. So Tantra is not an escape from Sutra. In fact, the vows and the intent, the actual difficulty of the vows that you take become even more intense. Except they're less explicit and they're less like rules of behavior. So, as we know, even though Christians worship Jesus and subvert the scapegoat mechanism, they also are prone to witch burnings and pogroms and all kinds of things. They haven't fully escaped the scapegoat mechanism. And Buddhism probably has another problem. It tends towards escapism, pacifism, self-denial, right? Because the philosophy is emptiness. The philosophy of Christianity generally is incarnation. And the philosophy of Buddhism is generally, Sutric Buddhism is generally emptiness. But when you move into Tantra, it's not mere emptiness. So sometimes we need a more potent medicine than sutra or mere renunciation. Sometimes you can't cure your pain or help the world through sitting in meditation and witnessing whatever arises or praying to Jesus or any of that. There's a limit to sutra because the scapegoat mechanism is so deep and potent and instinctual and deeply embedded in our collective unconsciousness. The sutric paths don't adequately deal with sex and violence, I would argue. And sex and violence or desire and arbitrary murder were Girard's main concern. I mean, I'm not saying that Christianity doesn't deal with that, but most of Christianity and most of Buddhism doesn't. That would be my argument. So while Christianity and Sutric Buddhism deal with the scapegoat mechanism to a certain extent, can they deal with them fully? To give you an example, there's the problem with Buddhism has often been said to be pacifism. Being pacifistic is very good until an army invades your country and you need to defend yourself. So if you look at Tibet, which was the big country of Vajrayana Buddhism, it was destroyed. And some would argue, and I've talked to Tibetan lamas who have argued this, who have said that they became too sutric. They were too into pacifism. They were too philosophical. They were too monastic. They lost the spirit of early tantra. So the Tibetan Buddhists became scapegoats of the Chinese, just as the Christian martyrs became scapegoats of the Roman emperor rather than defending themselves. So there's a potential masochistic element or shadow side to this self-sacrificing attitude of conventional Christianity and Sutric Buddhism. I'm saying this with respect to Christianity and also Buddhism. So I want to talk a little bit about Tibetan Buddhism because it's kind of interesting as a model. This is not a Tibetan Buddhist image. This is an image of the Bon tradition. So in the early days of Tibet, when Tantra entered Tibet, it was a big empire. Most people don't know this. It was a big empire on par with the Chinese. It was very cosmopolitan. There were Christians there. There were Manichaeans. There were Gnostics. There were Hindus. There were Zoroastrians in Lhasa, which is the capital of Tibet. There was a lot of trade of ideas and technologies, spiritual technologies, but actual trade as well along the Silk Route. What happened to Tibet is that it shut down, like a bit like medieval Europe during Christendom. Tibet closed itself off from the world and became a very otherworldly culture. It developed a sort of theological monoculture. So when China invaded Tibet in the Cultural Revolution around 1950, Tibet was very medieval, a bit like Catholic Europe. It was a feudal hierarchical society and they still had slaves. A lot of people romanticize Tibetan culture, so I think it's important to look at that, even though they were definitely victims of a genocide. So the problem with Tibet was that it was closed off. But in the beginning, there was this religion called the Bon religion. And when Buddhism entered Tibet, they had to, let's say, tame this already existing pagan religion, which in that tradition, they actually practiced human sacrifice. And one of Girard's claims is that almost all early societies, you can find a great deal of evidence for human sacrifice on a mass scale. We tend to romanticize indigenous cultures. And in one way, indigenous cultures, we need to respect them because they brought us to who we are. They're early proto-humans. But at the same time, they weren't living this kind of idyllic, romantic life. So Tibetans continued, they integrated this culture and they continued to practice Bon within Tibetan Buddhism. The Bon practices are a big part of Tibetan Buddhism, actually. And so there's this integration of the pagan aspect with the more universal Buddhist aspect. Here's something I thought was kind of interesting. I looked at when I was doing my research. When the 16th Karmapa, he was a great Buddhist saint, and he came to America. One of the first places he visited were the Hopi nations, and the Hopis they have a shamanistic culture very close to the Bon culture, so he felt very close to the American Indians. And here's just a very short film of he came to Arizona, and apparently the Hopi Indians said that he brought rain, and they had a drought for many years. And when the 16th Karmapa came, it rained everywhere, and so they considered him to be a sort of a saint of some kind. Anyway, so the point maybe is that we need to integrate the pagan aspect into religion, and not just sort of cut it off or kill it, or it has to be integrated into a genuine religion. we have to integrate our own traditions in a general religion, especially when we're dealing with an imported religion like Buddhism. So this is Chogyam Trungpa. And when he came to the West, he got his students to do all kinds of things like play golf. They engaged in military drills. They played the bagpipe. I think he's dressed up like a Cossack there. And you can see this is a trident. This is a trident symbol, and trident. This means passion, aggression, and ignorance. So victory over war was the symbol. So he actually got people marching around and did military drills with people so that they would try to relate to this aspect of war. Because he understood that what happened in Tibet. He understood the problem with Sutric Buddhism and the need for actually engaging. So Tantra is a path of diverse and skillful means. The word is upaya. It's about transformation, not escapism. Again, we have to say that it doesn't deny these powerful energies. So Tantra is often, it's not for everybody. It's often for crazy, eccentric people, and you're always warning people that it can be very dangerous. And it's a way of sort of intensifying. So in Vajrayana, there's actual practices to tame worldly deity, as they call it. So here we have a worldly deity. This is Steven Seagal. So a lot of these Tibetans who came straight out of medieval Tibet, right? I mean, really it was a really medieval society. They came to Hollywood, and the first thing they did was try to find the worldly deities and convert them to Buddhism. So Steven Seagal was one of those. He's considered to be a reincarnated Buddha. So just to conclude, I think we can meditate on this notion of sacrifice. And we can think of it in two ways, that there's unconscious sacrifice, which is the general state of things. And this does lead to memetic rivalry and scapegoating and all that, as we've talked about in length. And then there's the right kind of sacrifice, or good sacrifice, or proper sacrifice. And this is a tantric image, and you can see that it's almost an image of human sacrifice, right? But what is being sacrificed here is the ego. A sacrifice is directing our attention to one thing and not the other. Whenever we do something, we direct our attention somewhere and not somewhere else. We sacrifice all other possibilities. So we sacrifice our passion through work, or, our sexual desire through marriage. We tame violence through martial arts or philosophical dialectics or whatever. We have this desire and passion and violence within us, and it needs to be transformed. So I would say right sacrifice is right attention, and that instead of sacrificing a living being in tantric practice, you engage in these sort of imaginative exercises where you visualize yourself as a deity with various kind of weapons. And this is Padmasambhava. Owen was joking before the break, the tantric Jesus, and he was the founder of Tibetan Buddhism. And some people say he was Persian, but anyway, he has a skull cup in his hand, and he has a weapon a skull cup in the left hand with nectar usually. Sometimes it's with blood, but it's usually with nectar. And then he's giving the Vajra. This is like the heavy metal symbol, right? And the Vajra is a weapon that destroys illusion. And then you see that there's three skulls. There's old age, sickness, and death. So there's the three ages here. And then the trident, again, this is passion, aggression, and ignorance. So there's this flaming trident. There's all kinds of really elaborate symbolism in Tantra. The point of these kind of visualizations that you do is not to become this sort of egomaniac. It's that you align your perception with what is most divine and what is most true, and so that you actually change your psychosomatic image of yourself into deity. And deity is, so you don't renounce the Dionysian energies in Tantra. You work with them in a ritual context. For example, you might eat meat or drink alcohol, as we talked about before. And there's different informal and formal practices. You have to do it with the teacher, otherwise it's too dangerous. And anything can sort of happen in a tantric practice, but the basis is still in let's say wisdom and compassion and love. That has to be the basis of it. Otherwise, it's just something really weird, basically. So I think we practice tantra because sutra doesn't always work. Being holy, being pure, being detached from anger and desire can lead to hypocritical moralism, a dissociated attitude or repression, what Jung called the shadow. Sutra can be counterproductive and inefficient at a certain point. We always need a sutric base for tantric practice, again, as I keep saying. So it's about the creative transformation of these powerful energies, into collective art, into theater, into aesthetics, into poetry. So this is how we transform the scapegoat mechanism in tantra. I think through art. I think tantra is basically fundamentally a collective art form, and it works with sexuality. It works with various forms of celebration, and it's very expressive and celebratory, rather than life denying. Nietzsche talked about the life deniers. The tantric spirit is the opposite of this life-denying spirit. So again, I want to say that tantra is a science, an art, and a religion which deals with memetic desires and the scapegoat mechanism through intense expressiveness.